That Triathlon Show 330. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Dr. Stephan van der Zwaard. Stephan's area of expertise spans both exercise science and physiology as well as data science, so he can work at the intersection of those different areas, which is something we'll go into a little bit. But the main thing we'll discuss is one of Stephan's most recent papers, which is definitely on the physiology side of things. It's called Under the Hood, Skeletal Muscle Determinants of Endurance Performance. So we'll go into what these skeletal muscle determinants of endurance performance really are. But before we get into that, big thanks to our sponsors, Roka. Roka produce exceptional quality triathlon wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, performance sunglasses, as well as prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. If you want to go faster in the water or on the bike, a Roka wetsuit or tri-suit might be for you. Or if you just want to have a more comfortable, functional and stylish pair of eyeglasses, then look to their range of eyewear. Today I want to highlight Roka's Sim shorts, which are neoprene shorts that add buoyancy in the pool. This has several benefits in that it allows you to train the specific body position of swimming in a wetsuit without having to actually bring the wetsuit to the pool. It allows you to learn and understand good body positioning if that's something that you struggle with, and it can help you add more swimming volume, in particular when your legs are tired and sinky from bike and run training. And it can help you better work on other points for improvement in your stroke than just body position, such as your stroke mechanics, when the shorts can take care of part of the body position problems for you. They're brilliant quality shorts, they have great buoyancy, are extremely durable, so I can highly recommend them. Visit roka.com for 20% off your order. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 Indoor Swim Trainer is a swim training tool that you can use at home, allowing you to improve your technique, work on power and stamina, and save time and stay consistent. Consistency is the most important thing in training, but sometimes it's tough to find the time to get to the pool, so to have a time-efficient way to complement your pool and open water swimming at home is invaluable. In addition, you can use it to do things like swim, bike, brick workouts, and to work on perfect core activation and streamline with the help of the built-in instability element of the swim bench. The Zen8 Swim Trainer does not take up a lot of space. It is very affordable. It's more or less like a pair of good running shoes, and it's even more affordable with the 20% discount code that you can get on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Stephan van der Zwaard. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Stephan. How are you doing this morning?
Thank you. I'm doing very fine. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Why don't you start by giving the audience an introduction to yourself, who you are, and your background in endurance sports and in science?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm Stephan van der Zwaard. I currently work as an assistant professor at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. And I'm also working as a data scientist at the Leiden Institute of Advanced Computer Science. Maybe go a little bit back before, like how did you end up there? So first, when I think it was like 16, 17 years old, I was visiting one of the testing sessions of the former Jumbo-Visma speed skating, so the team of Jack Ory. And I saw all this incredible performance, and I was really amazed by this. Like, I want to know how could they achieve such a good performance. So that's why I studied human movement sciences and pursued a PhD in that as well. So I did that also at the Vrije University, mainly to discover like how can you explain differences in performance by making a whole physiological profile, so measuring a lot of different things, including a lot of skeletal muscle determinants, to figure out what distinguishes a really good endurance athlete and also a really good sprint athlete. But for now, of course, we're mostly focused on the endurance part. But that's what I really dived into. And later on, I got more into the data science part because I figured out that there's so much complexity. There's so many interactions between all these physiological determinants, of course, much more. So that's why I developed myself a little bit into data science. So learning a lot of different analyses. And now I'm currently actually forming a bridge between the two fields and trying to apply data science to learn more about physiology.
And how do you do that? Is that in your academic role, or is it consulting with federations or teams, or what does that look like for you?
It's a little bit of both. So academically, for sure, but also, we have contact with a lot of national teams. So, for instance, the Jumbo-Visma cycling, speed skating, but also the elite basketball players, elite volleyball players. And what we do is, we do a lot of analysis with the data they collect. So tracking, monitoring throughout the seasons, and see how, for instance, training characteristics relate to their performance or injury. So there are things that we do. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that is fascinating, and I'm sure that we will see lots of interesting work from that in the not too distant future. For today's interview, you have a paper fairly recently published that I read that was very interesting, and that is the main topic for today, which was on the skeletal muscle determinants of endurance performance, where you went through a bunch of, different skeletal muscle determinants of endurance performance and also did a bit of a meta-analysis, so quantifying them. Can we, before we get into that, first, if you can give a brief summary of what we might call the whole body determinants of endurance performance?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So I think back in the days was Michael Joyner and Edward Coyle. They made a very nice overview of what is the physiology of champions, and there, of course, the VO2 max. So the maximal oxygen uptake, the lactate threshold, so the first lactate threshold, and the efficiency, gross efficiency or economy, were mentioned as critical whole body determinants. And the lactate threshold combined with the VO2 max kind of explain what VO2 you can obtain during an endurance performance bout. So these three determinants are, I think, the most prominent there. They made a whole schematic out of that. And if you look a little bit more into that, I think Haugen made a good summary of that. What is the upper limits for VO2 max, for instance? Then you can see that, like rowers, the really, of course, the really physically large males and females, they tend to obtain the highest absolute VO2 max. So it's about 7 or 7.5 liters per minute, which is, it's insane how much that is. I think ventilation is always a problem there as well. And if you go relatively, then it's cross-country skiers, cyclists that tend to achieve very high values between 80 and 90 milliliters per kilogram. So, yeah.
One interesting question there. Why do you think that runners don't achieve high relative VO2 max? Because they are usually very light. So you'd think that it would be fairly easy for them to achieve a high relative VO2 max, but might that be related to their lower training volume, or do you have any theories or knowledge about that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm not sure. I think they might as well be in the same ballpark, but maybe it's just not the top upper limits that they achieve. So maybe they're like 70 high or up to 80. So I think if you compare the general field between all these disciplines, then maybe the difference isn't that much, but maybe mostly in the upper exceptions. Then maybe I'm not sure. I wouldn't know if this relates to training volume, because I think runners, they make a lot of kilometers every week, so could be related to the distribution. But we may get a little bit more into that later on. Yeah.
Perhaps it could also be related to how important economy is in running,
sure,
which it's not in cycling. So VO2 max might not be as important in running as it is in for example, cycling.
Yeah, it could definitely be that the economy is more important. Yeah.
But then again, cross-country skiing economy is very important there. So,
sure, yeah.
But that's a bit of a side point. One other thing I wanted to comment on there is when you mentioned that the VO2 max and the lactate threshold combine to determine the VO2, the oxygen uptake that you can maintain during a performance.
Yep.
Just for listeners that might not quite follow, it means basically that, one marathoner might be able to actually run at, let's say, 88% of VO2 max, even 90% perhaps, for an entire marathon, and another at only 80%. And then even if they have very similar VO2 maxes, then of course the one that can maintain the higher percentage of VO2 max is going to win, assuming they also have similar economies, of course. But that's why we have these three different determinants. They're all important.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think there
So,
it all to add, I think that the combination of the three is also very difficult to achieve. So what we see, if you look at all three determinants at once, there are not many athletes that excel at all three at the same time. So that is, I think that's also where it becomes challenging, like having a high VO2 max and a high economy or efficiency and a high lactate threshold. That isn't
yeah,
seen much. I know that there's one study about a multiple tour winner or Grand Tour winner. We all probably know who that is, but he was able to actually have a high efficiency, a high VO2 max, and a fairly high lactate threshold at the same time. Yeah,
yeah,
which may
yeah.
explain this
So,
performance.
yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I think probably someone like Eliud Kipchoge is another one that would be an outlier who has high values in all of those.
Yeah, I would assume that too. Yeah.
So now if we go down one level from these whole body determinants to the skeletal muscle determinants that you covered in the paper, can you discuss which ones they are and how important are each of them? So yeah, we can just take one at a time. I don't know if you want to take them in a particular order. You maybe have the questions in front of you here where I have them in particular order, but you can change the order as well if you want to.
Oh no, that's fine. Yeah, so maybe it's good to tell a little bit of how we determine this relative importance. So you mentioned the meta-analysis
Yep.
before. So actually, we dived into the literature, looking at like all these articles related to endurance performance and these skeletal muscle determinants, but also the whole body determinants. So we ended up with about 2,900 articles and filtered that down to 54, I think. And out of all those articles, we looked at the relationship between these skeletal muscle determinants and the performance determinants. First the fiber type, which of course that's one thing that comes to mind very quickly. I must say that is of course a very important one. So if we look at the effect sizes that this fiber type has on all these, so on the lactate threshold, VO2 max, and endurance performance, it's all large effects, meaning it's very important to explain differences in performance. If you look at what they achieve, so a typical endurance athlete will have like 70-80% of type 1 fibers in their muscle. Well, mostly it has been reported the vas lateralis muscle. So thinking of that, then you could expect like 70-80%. But we've observed also values much higher, like in the 90s as well. So that also happens.
So a higher proportion of slow twitch fiber or type 1 fiber would have a positive effect on all of the parameters on VO2 max and lactate threshold and economy. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they're typically more oxidative, so that helps. And also with respect to efficiency, if you look at the movement velocities for cycling, for instance, also for running, it's if you look at that frequency, then they are also more efficient than type 2 fibers. So there's also a relationship there with efficiency. Yeah.
Yeah. And for listeners that are interested, I recently interviewed Phil Bellinger on muscle fiber typology and some interesting research that he has done. So I'll link to that in the show notes, so you can go and listen to that. The next one is muscle fiber cross-sectional area.
Yeah, and that is an interesting one because, in theory, you would want to have larger fibers because they can produce more power. And if you have this combined with these slow type fibers, type 1 fibers, then of course you can sustain for a long time and produce a lot of power, which theoretically gives you a high steady state, which is of course what you want for the long run. But if we look at the data, then we see actually some negative results or negative relationship that this fiber cross-section area has. So on endurance performance and on the lactate threshold, it's actually impairing these performance determinants. So that is quite interesting. Like how can this be? And yeah, we have an idea why this is. So this is already back in the days. One of my supervisors, he did a lot of animal studies, and what he did is he he looked at the fiber cross-section area of all these animals, so from frogs to humans, mice, rabbits, shrinks as well, and they actually saw that the animals with the larger cross-section area, who were able to produce a lot of power, of course, they had low oxidative capacity. And the ones having very small fibers, they had a really high oxidative capacity. And this was kind of tightly regulated. So if you would draw it, it's kind of an hyperbola. So yeah, it's very strictly regulated. The question now is, if you are an athlete, do you have to deal with this? So yeah, you either go for the oxidative capacity or you go for larger fiber size. And then as an endurance athlete, yeah, maybe you want to focus more on the oxidative capacity instead. But on the other hand, what if you can get a little bit above this curve and maybe still have the same oxidative capacity, but a larger fiber size? And that helps, of course, to produce more steady state power. So I think that is very interesting to see, like, how can this help you, and what athletes are able to achieve this.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what do you think in terms of strength training for endurance athletes here? This is something that we have talked about quite a bit in previous episodes, but generally speaking, would you say that cross-sectional area doesn't increase too much in endurance athletes that do strength training, just because they also do so much endurance training? So it's more, you can get the neurological adaptations of strength training and get stronger, but you don't necessarily see that cross-sectional area increasing, or have you seen some other conflicting evidence, I guess, or do you have some other information than that actually you can, as an endurance athlete, also increase your cross-sectional area through strength training?
That's a very good question. So definitely the neurological adaptations are favorable, aside from the change in cross-sectional area, but also cross-sectional area may increase, but then of course it's always a balance with how much endurance training you do. There are some literature reporting larger type 1 fibers actually compared to type 2 fibers in professional cyclists. So I think in that sense there is some room there, but I think it also depends a little bit on the oxygen supply, and I may add a little bit about that later on, but or I can dive right into it. That depends on what you want. But
yeah. Feel free to dive right into it and transition into that.
Okay, yeah. So behind this negative effect of the cross-sectional area, you can think of, if you have a very large muscle fiber and the oxygen needs to go in, you have a larger diffusion distance, and that is of course not very helpful if you want to provide all the energy with oxygen. So you can of course look at the other side of the spectrum and say, okay, what if I increase my oxygen supply? And that can be done by having more capillaries, for instance. Then maybe the diffusion distance isn't that much of a problem. Or also on top of the capillarization, you also have the myoglobin, who transports the oxygen within the muscle fiber. And that actually helps to get the oxygen towards the mitochondria, who of course need this oxygen to create this energy. So I think these two, the combination of this myoglobin and capillarization within the muscle tissue, is very important to actually allow someone to still have larger muscle fibers while not negatively infecting the oxidative capacity that they have. And this is actually what we saw. So we had this study in 2018 where we looked at all these critical determinants, and there we saw that the cyclists that were able to get above this curve, so actually they were able to migrate a little bit upwards, which is already surprising and very interesting. Because if anyone could, you of course expect it from elite cyclists, but they actually showed that. But also looking at the group, then the ones who got higher upwards from the curve were also the ones who had better capillarization. So in that sense, that actually supports this theoretical argumentation of why this would work.
Yeah. And by the way, with regard to the effect sizes, we didn't mention that. What were the effect sizes for the cross-sectional area and now capillarization and myoglobin?
Yeah. So the effect sizes of the cross-sectional area were only small or moderate, but then mostly negative. If you look at capillarization, there the effects are mostly large, so it's quite large, which you would expect also. So if you look at capillarization, they typically you would find like 3 or 4 around the fiber. But if you go into the real endurance athletes, so professional cyclists, they can have like 5 to 8. And there's even some examples. For instance, we measured the Olympic track cyclist, and he got like 9 plus capillarizations around a fiber, which of course you can imagine that's way beneficial.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely there, and the literature is actually there is some literature there, but for the myoglobin that's much more difficult. So there isn't much literature on myoglobin out there, at least looking at these relationship with VO2 max, for instance, or endurance performance or lactate threshold. So that was much more difficult. So definitely something to study more in the future. But the effect sizes there were mostly moderate. But I have to say that this is only a couple of studies. So you have to take that into account.
Yeah, quite a bit of uncertainty there.
Yeah.
And then the final 2 determinants. First, we have mitochondrial oxidative capacity.
Yeah.
So if you can cover that.
Sure. Yeah. So mitochondrial oxidative capacity. There are of course a lot of mitochondrial markers that you can assess. So mostly we assess enzyme activity. So this could be citrate synthase or cytochrome C oxidase or succinate dehydrogenase, so SDH activities. That are the typical markers that are measured there. But you can also, of course, look at the actual respiration within the muscle fiber. And there, it's mostly from permeabilized fibers, which is it's a little bit different than doing histochemical analysis. But we've done a lot of research with the SDH activity, and there we saw that over a group, so it's really strongly related to VO2 max. So actually, we made a prediction. If you take a muscle biopsy sample from your vastus lateralis and would extrapolate that to your whole body, so say, okay, let's say this activity can be extrapolated, then the theoretical VO2 max, and we had that, and on the other end, we had actually a cycling VO2 max of all these participants. There were like 60 plus in total. So from chronic heart failure patients up to elite cyclists, VO2 max of below 10 till 80. And there you could see that actually over all the groups, the actual VO2 max was 90% theoretical one. And this was similar for all the groups, so for the chronic heart failure patients, for regular controls, and for these elite cyclists. And that is actually what is, of course, being mentioned in literature a lot. So VO2 max tends to be limited by this oxygen supply, so there's a little bit room for improvement. But the room for improvement isn't that much, so it's only 10%. Which is I think it's interesting. Also with these chronic heart failure patients, I think they just throw out the mitochondria at some point because these were stable. So if you look at acute, it may be different, but increasing the oxygen supply is then essential to improve the VO2 max, which is what's we commonly report in literature as well.
Yeah, that is extremely interesting, and of course there are many components to increasing the oxygen supply as well. Not just the ones we talked about here, but also just your the cardiovascular system. So there's that too.
Definitely
as well. But regardless, it's very interesting to see that you can first of all that you could even predict just based on the mitochondrial oxidative capacity. With get that sort of strong correlation that just shows how important they are. And then finally we have muscle glycogen storage.
We also have the physiological cross-section area, by the way. I forgot to mention that, but that's
physiological cross-sectional area.
So this is measured non-invasively using or MRI or 3D ultrasound. So it's actually the cross-sectional area of the entire muscle. So people are born with a different number of muscle fibers. The idea is that you cannot change that much, or at least that's the consensus today. But also there we see similar observations as we saw for the fiber cross-sectional area. So negative relationship with VO2 for instance. Yeah. And the glycogen, so typically endurance athletes have more glycogen in their muscles, but also resynthesize this glycogen faster. So in that sense, of course, that's really helpful, especially for the long bouts, long endurance events. So that's definitely something to consider. Yeah.
Yeah. And the effect sizes for muscle glycogen, and also I think we didn't mention the mitochondrial oxidative capacity effect size. What were they?
Yeah, the oxidative capacity was large, particularly for the lactate threshold and the VO2 max. And for the endurance performance, it's moderate, which is maybe a little bit lower than you would expect, but of course it's still interacting with all the others. And I think that is also important to measure to mention, like how do all of these interact. That's also what we analyzed. So for instance, the performance VO2 we discussed in the beginning. If you would explain this by all these different skeletal muscle determinants, then we could see that a high oxidative capacity, a small physiological cross-sectional area, and a high capillarization is important. So there you actually see the same determinants from this hyperbola we discussed. So a high oxidative capacity is what you want. You don't want to have too large fiber cross-section area, but in this case it's a physiological cross-section area, similar. And maybe the capillarization can be like a switch between the two to actually or like an intermediate to improve both. So the PCs had a negative relationship with the performance VO2, and the other two had a positive relation. So that's something to target maybe.
And in your publication, you had a very nice figure with lots of arrows going everywhere at first glance, but then when you look a bit closer, it is actually a very nice illustration of how the interactions between these different determinants. So listeners can go and have a look at that. I'll put a link in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
So then maybe we can move on to discussing a few different types of training and how they might impact either the whole body determinants or the specific skeletal muscle determinants of endurance performance. And of course, here we have to kind of be very clear that not all of this has necessarily been studied, and maybe, some of it may have been studied, but you haven't specifically done the studies. So part of this is more of a free discussion and a bit of speculation. So take it for what it is. But first, if we discuss and we use the kind of the scientific intensity domains of moderate, heavy, and severe intensity domain training.
Yeah.
So below LT1, between LT1 and LT2, and above LT2. If we start by, if you train in the moderate domain below LT1 or VT1, what sort of changes would you expect to see there on these different determinants?
So the moderate intensity training, especially training that a lot of volume, that increases VO2 max. So if you look at behind the scenes, then actually your calcium pathway is going up, so you make a lot of contractions, and that increases PGC1 alpha. So this is kind of technical, but that leads to mitochondrial biogenesis or biosynthesis. So in that sense, it helps to improve the VO2 max there. What's also happening is more central, that stroke volume increases with this low intensity training. So I think it's back in the days, but they analyzed the training volume that athletes had, and also the improvement in cardiac volume, and that was strongly related there. So in that sense, you both get the peripheral and the central adaptations there. But there's also literature out there, mostly by Jibala and others, saying that you can also do this high intensity training, and that maybe you're more effective even than doing this moderate continuous training. So it can either be that you improve more, or that you need less effective time of training to achieve similar adaptations. And that is so that is mostly how should I say that? Mostly an improvement in SDH activity also, but also the capillarization. So if you look at capillarization, the precursor of that is VEGF going up. That's what you actually, those things is what you see also with high intensity training. And the oxidative capacity going up, for instance, by this SDH activity, that can be related to AMPK going up. So it's more the energy status of the muscle. So you have a lower energy status, and that stimulates this mitochondrial biosynthesis as well. There's also a lot of literature, or recent literature, looking into this and saying, hey, this high intensity training, it's nice, of course, and it can lead to benefits, but maybe there's also like an upper limit for this. So this has first been studied in recreational persons, saying after, like, what was it, 14 sessions of high intensity training, that you could see still some improvements in this mitochondrial enzyme activity, so citrate synthase. But if you look at the actual respiration, it was lower. So you lose some of the effectiveness of this. So even though you have more biogenesis, it still isn't as effective. And the debate now is going on, like how can this be, and what may explain this, like too much of having too much high intensity is, and what is then too much. And similar things have been observed also in well-trained athletes recently by Cardinal et al. So yeah, these are very interesting things, and of course I didn't do all these studies, but it's interesting to see like fundamentally what's going on under the hood, and what will stimulate these adaptations, and also can we understand why this is. And if you look at the high intensity, I think it's definitely good to put some high intensity exercise in, and this is, for instance, mostly looking at the oxidative supply. So there's a very nice study by Vogt, who actually did 4 groups. 2 groups, they trained very low, so low in intensity, and 2 groups trained high in intensity. So we're talking about above 4 millimole of lactate, blood lactate. And on top of that, they didn't only do these high or moderate intensity exercise, but also added an hypoxic stimulus. So either they trained just low, or they trained at, I think it was like 3,000 meters, something more. And the interesting thing there is that they saw the myoglobin levels, the mRNA of the myoglobin levels, only going up in the high intensity combined with the hypoxia. So you really need a specific stimulus to get that, and all the other groups didn't. While also for the VEGF, which was a precursor for this capillarization, that showed a similar result there. So it's the combination of high intensity exercise, but also with hypoxia. And you can imagine, if you exercise in a hypoxic environment, it's even more difficult to get the oxygen in. So you're making it, the exercise-induced hypoxia, you actually make that even more. So it's a very strong stimulus, you must say. But that's at least for the oxygen supply, it seems that is that is definitely something to look into. So some high intensity the exercise there, but keeping in mind that you don't want the negative or the impairment of the mitochondrial oxidative capacity, which maybe So it is a balance, and it's difficult, but I think there the polarized training is, of course, also so exercising like mostly below the first lactate threshold, so about 80%, and then like 15-20% above these 4 millimole of the second lactate threshold. So I think some of the adaptations may be related to this high intensity part, while also the moderate intensity part that may be related to the stroke volume I mentioned before. Of course, we're not sure, but that can be the case. But also the biogenesis of mitochondria that you get from the repetitive movement that you do, especially with the prolonged exercise bouts. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting things there, super interesting things to unpack. Well, the first thing that I have to ask is with that study with the high intensity and hypoxia at altitude being the one that led to myoglobin improvements.
Yeah.
Since that is a local adaptation at the muscle level, could you achieve something similar with blood flow restricted training? I mean, this is speculation, of course, because I don't think something like that has been studied. But what do you think?
Yeah, I haven't seen such studies out there yet as well. But yeah, of course, you can imagine that instead of reducing the oxygen in the air, you're kind of occluding the blood flow and inducing a similar environment. So in that sense, yeah, you could expect also the oxygen pressure in the muscle to go down. But of course, there's also a lot of other things going on. So of course, your waste products, so to say, as the blood flow is stopped, you're not removing them. So it may actually be a more strenuous stimulus in that sense. I'm not sure, but it's definitely worth taking a look at.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to ask there is when you talked about how past a certain amount of high intensity training, you start to see these kind of impairments in the mitochondrial respiratory capacity. I remember seeing that study in recreational athletes that you mentioned, but did you say there that they've now done a study as well in elite athletes or well-trained?
And well-trained, yeah. I think it was 60 plus VO2 max that they studied that in. I think that was by Cardinal. I can reference the paper for you to add to the show notes.
I think it's a Swedish group from out of Karolinska Institute that's super interesting. So I'll definitely want to go and have a look at that. But yeah, I don't think it's something that a lot of people has seen or heard of. So it's good that you mentioned that, and the potential cost of past a certain amount of high intensity training, you actually you start to see potential impairments even, or at least non-improvements.
Yeah.
And then what was and then you mentioned the sort of the low intensity and the high intensity. What about training in the heavy domain between the first and second threshold? How would that potentially influence these different determinants?
Yeah, so then you're talking mostly about threshold training. And then, of course, so everything leads to improvement when you start as an untrained person. But the thing is, of course, what is more effective in a sense? And so the polarized training I was just referring to. So not doing so much in this domain compared to doing a lot of threshold training. It gives better adaptation, so better improvement in. This is mostly done on whole body determinants or endurance performance. So not so much in skeletal muscle determinants. There's not much out there yet. But threshold training I think there was recently a meta-analysis showing that it has a moderate effect size of being less favorable compared to this polarized training. So in that sense,
Michael Rosenblatt was actually a guest on the podcast.
Exactly. Before. Yeah. That's his work indeed. Yeah. So, but he only included 4 studies, so that means that also there's not much literature yet. There is more literature coming up, or at least coming out, of course, these days. So I'm definitely curious. To see these skeletal muscle determinants, how they adapt following polarized training, because that's very interesting. But not so much is out there yet, I think.
And in an applied sense, then, because you work with athletes, and athletes do threshold training, especially if we're talking, for example, cyclists and long distance runners and triathletes. What do you see is the role of that in terms of what are we trying to achieve with that? Is it just race specificity? And in that, if that is the case, or whatever is the case, when do you think is a good time to include that, and for how long would you include that if you were to just put on a coach's hat for a while?
Yeah, good question. I definitely think that race specific performance that's achieved with this threshold training. So it's definitely preparing for a match. It's good to do, but I think looking at the intensity distribution, like if you do most of your training in that zone, then that may not be as beneficial as shifting it more to the extremes. But still, there's a place, of course, for doing these type of sessions. I definitely think that. So we shouldn't see it more black and white in that sense. It's definitely important, but the question is like, how much of this do you want? And then probably you want it, but not as much. And probably just before competition, it's good to do. Of course, considering tapering and everything. But
Yeah. And one more question on this same along the same line is when we're talking about the high intensity training, are you aware of any work comparing the different types of high intensity training? For example, comparing sprint interval training with more traditional VO2 max intervals, if you want to call them that, like slightly longer intervals in the 1 to 5 minute range. What would you say about the different types of training we can do in the severe domain and how that might impact things?
Good one. So mostly the sprint interval training, repeated sprint training there in this extreme domain is very important. And we already saw a long time ago that this improves VO2 max. So that is of course always good. Interestingly, in the same line as I discussed with the capillarization, if you would add an hypoxic stimulus to doing these repeated sprints, then we see that there's actually a beneficial effect of that. So performing these repeated sprints in hypoxia actually improves VO2 max slightly more, and also the repeated sprint ability. So in that sense, also there adding this additional stimulus may facilitate these adaptations in a bit more detail. So Brocherie, who was also co-author of this paper, he did a nice meta-analysis on that. Yeah. So definitely something to look into. Of course, you need to consider that the recovery of these sessions takes a little bit longer. And maybe that also relates to the strength of such a polarized training regime. Like, if you do these high intensity trainings, of course you need to recover from that, and having this large bulk of low intensity training, of course, that helps in that sense. We actually did a study looking at this repeated sprint training in elite hockey players. So actually they did the combination of these sprints, but also in hypoxia. And the group who did it in hypoxia and the group who did it in normoxia, so just at sea level. And there we saw that the best improvements in mitochondrial oxidative capacity were with the group doing these sprints in hypoxia, which was already after 2 weeks. So it's quite fast. They were improving by 35%. So it's not a small improvement, especially for elite hockey players. But the thing is that you need to keep in mind is that this improvement of 35%, which was right after the 2 weeks of altitude training. If you look 3 weeks later on, then only 12% is left. So you also lose it quickly. So I think timing in that sense, this was an altitude training camp. I think they're really beneficial, but the timing you should definitely consider, like when would you do this? And that's very important.
Yeah. Great. On this topic, do you have anything else to add? Because then, then we're going to switch into some other different types of questions, including data science and so on. But do you have anything else you want to add on this topic or this publication and review that you did?
Maybe a little bit on the last, but it's a case study that's been done by Yakori, his group. Actually, this is kind of interesting because they also looked at this polarized training, but then in terms of rating of perceived exertion. How hard was your training session? And they looked at that 4 weeks before testing. And this is not in an endurance group, but in a speed skating group, or at least a speed skating NS1. So it's a case study. But 1500 meter, of course, also requires a lot of endurance background. And what they saw there is actually that training at an RPE of 2 or 3 was beneficial, had a positive relationship with, in this case, it was mean wing gait power, whereas an RPE of 4 or 5, so that reflects more or less the threshold zone, so between 2 and 4 millimolars of blood lactate, that was negatively related. And then an RPE of 7, there was a tendency to be beneficial again. So there also you see, and of course it's only NS1, although this was an Olympic champion in speed skating. But it's interesting to see that it's not only the long endurance events, but also only a 1500 meter speed skating. So I think that's interesting to see that. It has a wide applicability in that sense.
Yeah, that is super interesting. Really, really interesting. I wonder if the athlete phenotype also plays in there, because that's kind of
sure.
General kind of coaching wisdom that athletes that are more fast twitch dominant, at least to the eye, they tend to do well with doing their easy training really, really easy at an RPE of 2, whereas athletes that are more diesel engines, they can do their easy training at more of an RPE of 4, even 5, around that LT1. So that it might have something to do with that as well.
Yeah, that's definitely something to look into, the individual component and that, because of course this is NS1, but it can be completely different from someone else. So that's something that needs a lot of new studies, I would say.
Yeah, but I think it's anyway. It's just a really nice example that you really don't need to do the easy training hard to see great improvements.
Yeah,
it's super cool. So let's discuss your work in the field of data science a little bit. So can you just explain a little bit more about the different projects that you might have going on, and also generally, what do you think the current state of data science in endurance sports is at the moment?
Yeah, sure. What we typically look at is historic data of training. For instance, the example I just mentioned, that is actually logging the training sessions very meticulously and then seeing how that relates to performance in this sense, or testing. And that's what we do a lot. So we actually work together, collaborated with the volleyball federation in the Netherlands, and with the male team there. So we actually had a whole entire international season looking at all the training sessions they did, and actually they measured their jumping heights and also number of jumps with a small accelerometer. So you could actually see all the impact of this. And comparing that to injury. So when in what loading is too much in order to get overload injuries. So we made a model out of that. So on the one hand, you have all these predictors looking at all these different types of training. Like does it matter how high you jump, or does it matter how often you do strength training, or how long your training sessions are, or how much you vary them. All these different things you can, so that's called feature engineering in data science. I think that's a very important aspect of data science, because you're really capturing the data in all these different aspects, and then you're trying to use that as predictors to model the injury as a target. We saw that there's definitely some good results there, and also the jumping is very important in this group, which of course makes sense, but we're really providing thresholds also for the coach. So for instance, there was one, and this is personalized analysis. So we're looking at an NS1 basis. So we have one player who has, 150 days of training and also days of injury monitoring. And there you can actually model for this specific person, what do you find? And actually there was one guy who did a lot of strength training, and they already know that okay, when he does some training with his back, there is a limit. If you go above it, then he's out for a little bit. But they never know like what is this threshold, and the machine learning that we applied actually said, oh, this is this amount of kilograms. Of course, there's some uncertainty there, but they said, hey, this is really what we recognize, and also this providing this value gives us a lot of value to steer the training afterwards. So that is an example of what we do, and we do similar analyses in basketball, for instance, but also in cycling and speed skating. There's a lot of things going on there, especially with all the power meters. That it's so easy to collect this data, but then of course, how do you get the value out of that? That's where it becomes important, and combining data sources, so not only power but also heart rate, internal, external training load. How does that relate to performance? I think that is a lot of things that we're doing at the moment. And I'm sorry. Yeah, ask.
in cycling or speed skating, the endurance sports mentioned here, do you already have any examples of where you have found something that is really valuable and actionable and useful? Do you have any examples of that, or is it work in progress still?
There is some work in progress. There is also in cyclists we did, and I wanted to mention that. So this is a good bridge in that sense. We also did some unsupervised machine learning, and that is a little bit different, but it's clustering. So actually, you're providing a data set and say, okay, look at all the relationships that are in the data set to form people who are very similar in a sense. And there we used anthropometry to look at the people there, and there you could see that there's definitely different types of cyclists in a sense, and this is actually cross disciplines as well. So actually we had team pursuit, road cyclists, and track sprinters. The sprinters were completely different from the other two groups, which of course you would imagine they're much more bulky and much more mesomorph if you're into the somatotypes. But the other two that actually was a mix of team pursuit and road cyclists, and of course you can use these types of clusters to look further and see, okay, what is their performance, but also can we train them differently? So kind of using the physique and physiology of these people to be more specific in your training steering as well. So that is also something that is already out there.
Yeah, that is interesting, and it's good that you mentioned that being unsupervised machine learning. I think that's something that is quite an important thing for people to understand, not just in endurance sports, but in anything, because machine learning is becoming such a big part of society these days. That depending on what kind of machine learning we're talking about, it might look very different, because in some cases you have a lot of assumptions or constraints or models selected and created by the programmers or the people behind the model, and then while you have all the fancy machine learning going on there, you still have something that a human person selected in the background. So and that can be a good thing, of course, if you know a lot about the subject matter, but it can also be you're still relying on some knowledge or some assumptions of a human being in certain cases in the supervised machine learning, or different depending on what model you're working with. So all that to say that machine learning comes in many different sizes and shapes, if you will.
Definitely.
So yeah.
There's a lot of variety there. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Where do you see data science and machine learning going in the next few years within endurance sports specifically?
Yeah, I think it just started in a sense. So there's it's really at the frontiers, I must say, of combining these types of analyses, and it's also a different perspective. Like, we're really used to these well-controlled, hypothesis-driven experiments, and actually applying data science is maybe completely different. You're looking back to data that's being tracked very meticulously in the past, but then trying to learn more or new insights from that. So I think it also has a shift in that sense, and that takes time for people to adopt that. So I think there's plenty to go on in a sense, and of course there's also so much about doing computer vision, doing image analysis. So I know in Antwerp they're doing a lot with sprinting towards the finish line in cycling, the last bits. Like how does that work with the trains that are being formed, and they use all these analysis from cameras that they. So that is something completely different. How you can also apply data science. So I think there's so many ways, so many application that you can actually do. So I think there's much more to come in a sense. But the important thing there is that you want to have people who know the domain, know what problems are there out there, and people who know a lot of data science, and definitely work in teams in that sense to solve questions with new tools. If you would summarize it, I think.
Yeah. And then moving on from that topic, can you give 3 pieces of advice about anything related to endurance sports for amateur endurance athletes that want to improve their performance?
Sure. Yeah, I think the very important thing is monitor your progress. Keep track of what you do, and not only what you do in terms of how fast you do your runs or your cycling bouts or your swims, but also how hard did you perceive them. So, for instance, the Jack Ori study shows that with just a simple measure of saying, okay, my exercise bout was this difficult or this strenuous, that gives so much information already. So tracking that is very important, and gives you the opportunity to, maybe if you have a new question or a new way of looking at your data, you can always go back 2 years or more if you have tracked that data. So I think there's a lot of value in that. So I would definitely suggest to do that. Based on what we saw in the mini review, I would say focus on the oxygen supply capacity. I think there's a lot of potential there, underlying the improvements in performance. And also,
can you repeat there? So, in terms of training advice, what type of training would you recommend primarily to work on that oxygen supply capacity?
Yeah, so definitely do some high intensity training, maybe even in hypoxia, so some altitude camps if you can. But of course, also try to not do too much of them, because you have the negative effects on the oxidative capacity. That is what I would suggest. And in similar lines, vary your workouts, and not only to achieve this polarized training, which may be helpful, but also in terms of motivation. Like, try to really find the workouts that you like to do. Also, of course, do some that you maybe don't like, but really adopt to preference and vary in what you do. That's really helpful for adapting.
Yeah, great. And what's one thing that you are currently learning about or are fascinated by, and why?
Yeah, what I'm very fascinated by is this curve I was talking to you about. So in nature, it seems that it's very tightly regulated. Either you go towards the explosive side, the sprint side with the large fibers, or you go to the oxidative capacity, to the endurance side. So actually, that says you cannot combine both. But still, there are some athletes who are able to find a way to do it. And I'm really curious to find out, like, how do they do this? And in previous work, we saw that myoglobin and capillarization are very important targets there. But there are more, and there's definitely work coming out looking into that as well. So that's very fascinating, at least for me.
Oh, I think so, and I think if I remember correctly, you have that is another figure in your paper. So if listeners don't quite know what you see, what that curve looks like, then again, go and look at the paper. It's there.
Yeah.
And let's move on to the rapid fire questions. So take just one sentence to answer each of these.
Yeah.
And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource?
It's Faster by Michael Hutchinson.
Yeah. A good cycling related book there.
Yeah.
And what's an important habit that you've benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
Yeah, really tracking my my trainings and also well-beings at the same time. And always I can go back to that and learn more about personal events or things that I did. So that's definitely something, a habit that I still do every day with only 2 minutes of work. So yeah.
Great. And finally, who's somebody you look up to or that has inspired you?
Yeah, that's definitely Jack Ori. Seeing how he approaches science and also putting it into practice, and really being keen on a proper data collection. That's something that I really admire and also try to implement in my own field of work.
Excellent. And finally, where can listeners follow you and your work?
You can find me on Twitter. So Stephan VD Zwaard. There you can find me. Also, I'm on ResearchGate, and I also have my own website, stephanzwaard.com, which you can visit. So either one of those, or just contact me via email. That's also good.
Yeah. For the science geeks out there, you have a pretty cool tool on your website I found which aggregates all of the sports science papers from the recent week. So that's one to have a play around with.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Stephan. It's been a really nice chat with you. I learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners have as well. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. van der Zwaard. As usual, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com, where we'll link to all of Stephan's profiles and website, as well as his paper, Under the Hood, Skeletal Muscle Determinants of Endurance Performance. This one is available as full text, open access, so everybody can have a look at it and read it in full if you want to. In addition, remember that on scientifictriathlon.com, you can go to the podcast page and you can check the different tabs in the episode archives and, for example, filter for science and physiology episodes like this one. And then you can find similar episodes that you might be interested in listening to if you haven't listened to all of the episodes on the podcast. We are up to quite a few now. So that might be something that I just want to mention every once in a while so that you're aware that you can find previous episodes that you might be interested in that way on the website. I also want to remind you, we do have a few slots available still on the training camp in Mallorca in 2022. It will be at the end of March to early April. You can find all the details on the website, or you can just email me. What I think is really unique about our camp is that the success criteria for us is not just that you will leave the camp a fitter athlete, but that you will leave the camp a much smarter and much more educated athlete, as we will make sure that we talk with everybody in detail and help you with your specific training questions. We will have workshops and seminars and the like, so you will really learn a lot through that week together with all of us scientific triathlon coaches and other coaches as well. So there will be a really, really good week of training and learning. I hope to see you there on Mallorca in 2022. Check it out on scientifictriathlon.com. Next Monday, we have an episode on if and how you should take a season break. We will feature coaches Philip Sipe, Helle Fredriksen, and Emma Carney. So that will be another one where I interview several coaches to get differences in opinions and nuances of opinions. So I hope that you will enjoy that. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses, and get 20% off your order with a promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. And thank you to Zen8. Use the Zen8 swim trainer to improve your technique, power, and stamina, and increase your swim stimulus frequency even when you can't go to the pool or open water. Get 20% off the Zen8 swim trainer with a promo code that you can get on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.